Hi, welcome to History 1302, U.S. history since 1865, and today we're talking about the rise of the modern conservative movement. So after the 1960s, the U.S. was a very divided nation. The mood in the United States was very bleak for reasons that we've discussed in the last few weeks. For one, the economy was in a very bad state. The 1970s witnessed the end of the Golden Age. The average American was poorer in 1980 than in 1970, and the economy just wasn't growing as rapidly as it had after World War II. Prices were rising and people were losing jobs. In fact, in 1975, unemployment was at 9%. So what was going on? The economic problems in part stemmed from the process of deindustrialization. That is, the removal, or rather the fact that factories were leaving the United States and going overseas. So after World War II, manufacturing in the U.S., it started to shrink slowly over time. And this is what led to the rise of the Rust Belt. This is regions of the United States, typically in the Midwest or the Mid-Atlantic, where major industries moved overseas. Factories moved overseas. They were following cheap wages. This is the logic of capitalism. If you can pay your workers as little as possible, you can maximize your own profits and your profits for shareholders. So in the U.S., starting in the 1960s and 70s, even a little earlier to say, there started to be a complaint that unions were driving up wages, which is true. That's 100% true. But that was part of the reason for American prosperity in this period. It was part of the reason why there was a golden age, in fact. The other thing is that companies resented having to pay benefits to their workers, like retirement and healthcare and safety taxes. And so they chose countries that looked more like the Gilded Age in the U.S. They chose countries that had fewer rights for workers and fewer regulation. And so in the 1970s, the United States, for the first time, begins to import more goods than it exported. This meant that the middle class, in particular, and the working class as well, were squeezed. They were working hard for the same pay. Between 1953 and 1973, the median family income actually doubled. But between 1973 and 1993, real wages stayed the same. This is the context for the rise of the modern conservative movement. So when we talk about conservatism, I want to be really clear about what the ideology was in the 1970s and 80s. The debate between conservatives and liberals goes back to the debates between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who disagreed on how involved the national government should be in the economy. The conservative ideology in the 1970s was centered around several tenets. The first was the prioritization of economic liberty and the belief that the government should not restrain one's economic liberty and ability to spend the money how they wanted to. Similar or closely tied to this idea was the idea that capitalism was liberty. The free market was the epitome of freedom. The second tenet of the conservative movement is the fear of big government. The fear that the federal government in particular, will become oppressive. And the conservative movement of the 70s really prioritized the idea that the people must be sovereign and in control. The third tenet was a very fierce anti-communism and a belief that the U.S. government should act and be able to act unilaterally to make foreign policy decisions. That is, that the United States didn't need to consider other people's opinions or policies or even their democracies. That the United States had a right to overthrow and wage war against governments that it constituted a threat in some way, or that it perceived to be communist. The fourth tenet of the conservative movement was a real cultural conservatism. The conservatives of the 1970s and 80s were very worried about the changing sexual values, the changing role of women, the growth of LGBTQ rights, and they perceived all of these changes to be leading to the death of the family. There was this real fear that the U.S. was straying from its Christian roots and that conservatives needed to fight back. And you'll see a little bit more of that in the reading for this week. So who's going to support these ideologies or these tenets? In the 1970s, a conservative coalition begins to form. The first group is big business, which sides with Republicans because they want little regulation. They want deregulation. The second group is cold warriors, people who are aggressively advocating for U.S. intervention abroad to stem communism. The third is white supremacists or white Southerners who believed that the civil rights movement and the civil rights legislation had impinged on their freedoms, on their freedom to associate with whoever they wanted, on their ability to control and make decisions for their own communities. The fourth is white suburbanites in the Sun Belt. If you recall, the Sun Belt is the region between California and Florida that really began to develop and develop economically in the Cold War period, thanks a large part to government investment into federal decisions to strategically locate defense industries in these places to help them modernize their economies. The fifth is religious fundamentalists. So the religious fundamentalism was a movement that was growing in popularity in the 70s, especially we might think of the evangelical movement as part of this. They believe in biblical literalism and they prioritize traditional family values. And in the 70s, they're becoming more political. They believe that the U.S.'s central problems stem from a lack of faith. One of the leaders of the religious fundamentalist movement was Jerry Falwell, who used sort of the model of Christian missionary fundraising to create the organization called the Moral Majority, whose focus was to elect pro-life candidates. Falwell and his supporters believed that freedom was out of control and that you had to control people's sexuality, specifically women's sexuality, because it threatened the family. So the first big victory of this coalition was the move to stop the ERA, which you're reading about this week again. The ERA is the Equal Rights Amendment that just simply calls for equal rights among the sexes. It had passed Congress and it had gone to the states for ratification when conservatives, especially conservative women, began to rally to stop it. Phyllis Schlafly in particular led this movement. She believed that women should be afraid because the Equal Rights Amendment, according to her, would take their rights away. And they effectively blocked it. And that's what the primary source readings for this week are, so I want you to read that and think about why Phyllis Schlafly is so afraid. This is the coalition that is going to come together to elect Ronald Reagan in 1980. So Ronald Reagan was a movie actor. When he's running for president, he promises a Reagan revolution, that he's going to restore American greatness. He says, and his slogan is that government is the problem, not the solution, and that we need to reduce it in order to restore liberty. He promises to reverse the New Deal and the Great Society. He believed that they created more problems. And he promises a return to small government, lower taxes, but also increased military spending. So there are two aspects of Reagan's presidency that I want you to make sure that you understand. The first is his economic agenda, which can be called, and which has been called, Reaganomics, or the trickle-down economics, or supply-side economics. This is the idea that if the government would just lower barriers for suppliers and for investment, goods will be cheaper and consumers will spend more. Put differently, or more concretely, he advocates for higher interest rates and lower taxes for the wealthy, deregulating businesses, because all of those moves, according to him, will stimulate and to his economic advisors will stimulate private investment, will stimulate people to work harder because they'll get to keep more of their money. So he implements much of this agenda. And what is the result? I want you to pay attention to that as you do the reading for this week. I'll tell you right now that the U.S. budget deficit grew because despite Reagan's promised cuts to social programs, which we'll talk about, he is just spending so much money on the military. The economy does grow, but inequality grows with it. In the 1970s, the top 1% of Americans owned 20% of the country's wealth, and by 1990, the top 1% owned 40%. The middle class is stagnating, and the poorest 1/5 of the population is growing poorer. Some historians have argued that these policies ushered in the second American Gilded Age that we're still living in. In particular, they point to the deregulation of the savings and loan industry, which you'll read about in the textbook. The federal government allowed them to now invest in real estate speculation, in real estate deals that went bad. And when they went bad, the federal government bailed them out. But the government would not bail out the poor. In fact, this is a period when the U.S. government cut the food stamps program, cut job training programs, cut housing subsidies and lunch programs. But the percentage that these took up in the U.S. budget was so small that it could not possibly offset the money that was lost on the tax cuts to the wealthy and to the greater military spending. Moreover, the federal government did not touch Social Security or Medicare. These are the biggest, most expensive programs because they benefit the middle and upper classes, and they're very popular. And it would have upset the baby boomer generation, which is a significant share of the electorate. The second aspect of these Reagan years that I want to make sure you understand is his foreign policy. So Reagan was a Cold Warrior. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire and promoted the buildup of the U.S. military. He spent trillions this way. He also supported anti-communist governments, even if they were authoritarian, even if they had brutal human rights records. In Nicaragua, he supported a paramilitary organization that was waging war on a democratically elected government that was socialist but moderate. And you'll read more about that this week. In the late 1980s, he did begin peace talks with the Soviets, and he takes a lot of credit for ending the Soviet Union, but some historians have argued that the Soviets really defeated themselves, and they essentially went bankrupt in this period. Still, Reagan was considered, and is considered, a hero. In this period, to be liberal became a bad word, and in fact, Democrats would move to the right as a response to Reagan's popularity, and you'll see this in the textbook. As you do the reading this week and as you watch the documentary, I want you to think about Reagan's legacy. How would you evaluate it? What policies were successful? Which policies were not successful? All right, that's all for this week. Good luck.